In 1989, political scientist Francis Fukuyama published an article, The End of History, later expanded into a book in 1992. In this book and article, he argued that with the end of the Cold War and the fall of communism, liberal democracy had triumphed as the final form of human government. Fukuyama's thesis was extremely influential during the 1990s and early 2000s. However, over the last decade and a half, a growing numbers of thinkers and scholars, including Fukuyama himself, have come to question this assumption, namely that history has ended and we've reached the final form of human civilization. So today, we ask, have we reached the end of history, or have we reached the end of history? I'm Djene, and you're listening to Talking History. With us to discuss the end of history, and more specifically the end of history, is writer, political analyst, and co-author of the fittingly titled enough book, The End of History, published by Zero Books in 2021, Alex Hochuli. Alex, welcome to Talking History.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be talking about all these endings.
Yeah, well, this was definitely a topic that we wanted to cover on Talking History. So I mentioned at the top here Fukuyama and his famous article, The End of History. So I think in order to have this conversation, we need to really expand on what did Fukuyama mean exactly by the end of history, and what was the context in which he came up with this thesis?
Well, so Francis Fukuyama is an American academic who in 1989 wrote this article, The End of History, and then he expanded upon this idea in 1992. Let's deal with the context in which he writes this. First of all, in 1989, you can see the Berlin Wall coming down. By 1992, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the whole system of state socialism in the East had also fallen apart. Let's deal with the misconceptions and vulgarizations of the end of history first. I think a lot of people understood that to mean that nothing would ever happen anymore, that there would be no change. That's not what he intended by that. There might still be new nation states founded, new cities, technological revolutions which transform human life. What the end of history meant in a much deeper sense was that with the end of state socialism, that alternatives to global capitalism, and not just alternatives, but different visions of ways of organizing human society were no longer on the table. Liberal capitalism, liberal democracy was triumphant, and triumphant all over the world. And even those places where it wasn't, you might say, well, Iran or North Korea, those are exceptions to the rule. It also meant that any challenges that would emerge to liberal democracy around the world wouldn't be premised anymore on any notion of a higher order of society, of promising greater freedom. So you might have things like Islamic jihadism, but that wasn't a universalist vision which promised an improvement to people's lives. It's quite a reactionary idea which would seek to take societies back, and it was only really holding some appeal for limited sections of the world population, limited regions of the world. So it meant that liberal democracy was triumphant, the only game in town, the only recipe anymore. And there was the end of evolution, of evolution in terms of human societies, of what people could do. The meaning of the end of history then was that politics would be concerned now only with means, no longer with ends. The fundamental questions about how to order society were over, and you have a kind of fixed recipe of how to do things. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily that it would be neoliberal capitalism. Fukuyama himself probably had more appreciation for somewhere like Denmark than the United States, but these are just small iterations on the overall theme. And so in that context, you have very few kind of options, and politics becomes a little bit, well, glum, right? If you don't really have any fundamental contestation over ends about how to organize society, and things just become a matter of technical implementation, for a lot of people, for the broad mass of people, political participation no longer becomes very important. In fact, Fukuyama, particularly in his 1992 book, talks about the way that things might become, limited really to consumerism, to private life, and ultimately perhaps even nihilistic. And then Fukuyama then was a little bit glum about this, even though his preferred form of society of liberal capitalism had triumphed. He recognized that a liberal capitalism without any other challengers might become a little bit glum.
Okay, so what were the core characteristics of politics in this end of history moment, particularly in the 1990s? And especially, I want to focus on an idea you touch on in your book, which is post-politics. What is post-politics, and how does that differ from traditional politics, as it were?
Okay, so apologies to start with the definition, but I think it's important that we conceptualize politics not just as administration or kind of technical management from top down, but fundamentally about contestation over how society should be organized. In that regard, then politics looks quite a lot like democracy. Democracy not as a set of institutions, parliaments, congresses, and so on, but is about popular participation, even popular sovereignty, and debates over how to organize society. What happens in the post-war period is that politics is already a bit circumscribed in terms of being fought out over the terms of liberal democracy between social democracy and conservatism. But nevertheless, there's still a healthy political competition. There are people being members of political parties, of trade unions, of civic associations, of churches, and so on, all of which form the capillaries of formal politics. What happens at the end of the Cold War is that post-politics is installed. Now, what is post-politics? That means not just that politics is somehow attenuated or reduced or lacking in intensity, but politics itself is foreclosed. Popular contestation is foreclosed. So the social contract quite radically transforms. Rather than people participating in politics and their interests and ideas being channeled upwards towards the state, people are really expected to kind of stay home. They're expected to stay home in the sense that they can dedicate themselves to their family, to private consumption, in exchange for political passivity. So you might have something like increasing inequality, but there's still going to be an element of economic growth, of jobs, and particularly, and this is very important, of consumer goodies, and that was provided through an expansion of credit and through China's entry into the world market. So there was this influx of cheap goods. So that was able to keep the kind of social contract together, at least until the global financial crisis of 2008. But basically, that's post-politics. And for those of us who grew up in the 1990s and 2000s, it was at least I felt it very real that there was nothing that could really possibly happen politically. There were even big events like 9/11, but that didn't really shake the fundaments of what the political order was, about how things were organized. And there was never really any credible sense that things could ever really change, or that you as a political actor would be able to change anything. So maybe we're already kind of getting towards the end of history, but at least the end of history from 1989 onwards is one where there is no longer the alternative of state socialism. That has completely collapsed as an actual form of organization of society in a different part of the world, but also the effect that had in terms of disciplining capitalist elites in the West was no longer there. So politics itself is transformed. So I think it's important to understand all of this as a sense of a crisis of politics itself. It's not just that the content of politics changes, or it's a little bit more to the left or a little bit more to the right, it's red or it's blue, but that politics itself disappears or is in very deep crisis.
So politics of the post-politics variety is more framed in terms of who can manage something better. There's a problem, and it's an issue that is not going to be dealt with through the old form of politics, but through a better form of management. That, political party A will critique political party B for just not doing the job of managing society very well. Everything is sort of based on what is the, let's say, technocratic way to approach a political problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you say manage society, and I think that's really appropriate because it is fundamentally about a top-down notion of just administering society, managing society, and basically keeping the kind of profitability game on the road. And in that context, there's no debate over the ends of politics. It's merely about means, right? And if you have a set recipe that you basically have neoliberal globalization, you have free markets and human rights, politics is very circumscribed. At the most, it's circumscribed, and really politics doesn't exist in any fundamental sense, in the true meaning of the word.
And the kind of socio-political consequences of this is, not that we don't have elections or that we, don't get involved with quite, let's say, controversial issues, but rather that people are not invited into the political process. They cast their vote and then they leave everything up to the managers. They don't participate in the same way in, let's say, civil society organizations like labor unions, churches, et cetera, in the same way that they did perhaps in the 1950s and 60s.
Well, yeah, and actually what's politically contestable is incredibly reduced. I mean, this is the reason that politics becomes about spectacle. It becomes about the sex scandals of politicians, if you think about Bill Clinton, or it becomes about culture wars, more about questions about who I am and what my values are, rather than how society should be organized. And you can take probably the most classic example of the neoliberal depoliticization of society, which is the independence of central banks. So the Fed or the Bank of England or the European Central Bank are independent bodies which are no longer touchable by politicians, by elected representatives. And so the central bank sets interest rates, which are fundamentally a political question, not a technical question, except that the lie that was sold to people throughout the 1990s and 2000s was that this was just a technical matter. It should be left to the experts who know best, and they can just get on with running the economy while you can dedicate yourself at most, if you want to feel involved, to, kind of cultural debates or, whatever, or be sensationalized by scandals or whatever it might be. And that's if you're interested in politics, because a lot of people just tuned out. And you can look at participation rates in voting, turnout rates, and they, collapse below 50% across many Western democracies. And one of the testaments to the return of politics has been, increasing turnouts as elections seem to matter more again.
Okay, so let's turn to this crisis in the end of history moment. You mentioned earlier the 2008 financial crisis. So even an event like 9/11 didn't put an end to this end of history moment. But when we turn to the economic crisis of 2008, you make the case that this is a kind of moment where we begin to see the return of politics. Can you talk about that? And also perhaps a little bit about this concept of anti-politics, which emerges in response to this post-political moment.
Yeah, so you'll notice I'm saying the word politics and with various prefixes, but and that might seem kind of awfully technical, but I think there's an important reason for this, and it's precisely because politics itself comes into crisis, and so you have a lot of different ways that politics is repressed or tries to reemerge, and it emerges often in perverse forms. So let's go through the kind of chronology. You have the 2008 crisis, which is a fundamental shock to the mode of accumulation and also to the political deal that was on the table, which, as I just mentioned, you let the technocrats get on with running the economy, you're going to have your consumer goodies and you don't really have to worry about anything else. There's obviously not going to be any contestation over higher wages or, kind of labor organization or anything like that. But, you're going to have your kind of consumer goodies being shipped over as long as you kind of, stay relatively quiet. That was the deal. But suddenly, you have this very deep economic crisis, and that puts into question this whole promise that was made about these technocrats being competent. But it takes a little while until the political consequences of that really come to become clear. I think it's such a shock, and you have a whole generation which has been depoliticized. When 2008 comes around, people know it's a big deal, but it's not entirely obvious what the consequences of it are. You start to see economic consequences in terms of foreclosures, particularly in those places where the housing market was really central to the economy, and indeed the whole economic order of the 90s and 2000s is premised on rising asset prices and gambling off the back of that. When that collapses, you get things like Occupy, which raise this notion of the 99% against the 1%, which, is problematic in terms of its conceptualization, perhaps, of politics, even of class politics. But nevertheless, it raises the notion that there is a conflict of interest between the mass of people and the elites, something that was ruled out because it's important to remember the politics of the 90s and 2000s are all about consensus. We all agree, we're all on the same boat. We just need to make sure that we have the best managers there to make sure that things are implemented in the proper way. To raise the idea that there's a fundamental conflict of interests in society is politicizing. That then kind of begins to unfurl, really across the world. You have the Arab Spring, which in turn influences a lot of people in Southern Europe, which is particularly exposed to the consequences of the crisis and to the swinging austerity that's implemented there. So across Western Europe, and particularly in Southern Europe, in the periphery of the European Union, you have revolts, you have the mass occupation of squares, and ultimately the generation of new political parties. So in Spain you had Podemos, in Greece you had Syriza, or you have the attempt to take over neoliberalized, very centrist political parties, which are ostensibly of the left, but which no longer are. And I'm thinking here of the US Democrats and of Labour in the UK, which there are populist insurrections within those parties, right? So you have Bernie Sanders trying to get the nomination for the presidency, and Jeremy Corbyn and his Momentum movement taking over the Labour Party. And indeed, as they conceived of it, kind of taking back the Labour Party to its socialist roots. And that attempt at kind of left populism, or millennial socialism as it's been called, is one of the principal ways in which the return of politics expresses itself as a challenge to the existing order of post-politics. You also have challenges on the kind of populist right, and the insurrection, and indeed the much more successful insurrections on the populist right. Donald Trump getting the nomination from the Republicans, and various right-wing nationalist populist or conservative populist, however you wish to describe it, these politicians and parties taking power across Western Europe. And it's important then to kind of return to this idea of politics. What is politics, and then what would be anti-politics? I already talked about post-politics, the foreclosure of political contestation. Anti-politics is the angry rejection of political establishments. So you have this return of politics, this politicization of things, of the basic statement that they do not represent us, right? That there is actually, that politicians are not drawn from society or kind of an organic, that there exists an organic link between the masses and the political institutions. In fact, people start going, well, you know what? There's actually this political class, this caste of politicians who are really separate and removed from the rest of society. They go through their formation in terms of education, in terms of universities, working in think tanks, and then being congressional aides or whatever, and then becoming elected politicians. And they have this vision of the world and vision of society, which is completely removed from the rest of society. Indeed, they see society and the mass of citizens as an object to be manipulated and managed, not as their legitimate representatives. And so this anti-politics emerges both on the left and the right, and indeed in the center as well in various cases. And you can think of the Five-Star Movement in Italy as a kind of centrist populism, which might be a term that people might balk at and go, well, no, either you're a centrist or a populist. But no, there are centrist populisms as well, all of which basically say they don't represent us. And so it really seized on this very deep crisis of representation which had emerged, which was covered over, to return back to our story of 1990s and 2000s, which was covered over by a steady amount of economic growth, social stability, consensus, and so on. Once that economic basis falls apart, the political lack of representation and the condescension with which citizens are met from the part of the political class becomes really exposed. And people really, really hate politicians and even hate politics. Right. And so, and in fact, the hatred of politics is the way that politics returns, which is a bit paradoxical. But this is what has actually happened over the past 15 years.
So when we talk about something like populism, we often associate it with, let's say, the extreme right or the extreme left. But you're making the case that actually populism is more of a disposition that emerges after this economic crisis, this notion that our sort of idealized understanding of democratic politics has been usurped by a political class, and that political class is detached from society. So, for example, as you mentioned, politicians tend not to come out of, let's say, the labor movement or business, but rather politics has become a career that someone pursues. Politics is not something that people from society participate in, but there is a kind of cadre of people, both on the traditional left and the traditional right, who do all these things. Like you say, they work as a congressional aide, they work as a party apparatchik, and then, when it's their turn, they enter into the sort of political class, the height of the political class as a representative. But really, they're not sort of these political parties are basically just managing everything. And the populist revolt is, whether on the left or right, or as you say, even in the center, is this idea that we have to take back politics from this political class that has become detached from society and usurped democracy.
Well, exactly. And the way that this is normally talked about is technocracy versus populism. I think this is fairly well established nowadays. People understand politics increasingly to be not about left versus right, but about technocrats versus populists. Indeed, many of the participants in politics at the elite level conceive of things this way, right? So you get politicians saying, "Oh, we have to stop populism," and really they mean, I don't know, they mean Donald Trump or they mean Brexit or whatever. And then you have those associated with the populist right who say, we need to take on kind of the neoliberal technocratic globalists or whatever. And so this is the terms in which politics is fought. But we try to avoid the use of populism in part because it's used to apply to just about anybody, right? So like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is a populist. Bernie Sanders of the kind of social democratic left is also a populist. But you also get figures like Tony Blair, who on the one hand is a technocrat, but also had very populist elements to it. So did Bill Clinton in the 1990s, right? Talking about the heartland, talking about the people. So you start looking at politics and going, well, I'm not so sure that there's such a clear division to be made between technocrats and populists. Both are different kind of styles, and politicians maybe are a bit more technocratic or a bit more populist in style, or both at once. But it's not something which can be clearly limited or placed on the political spectrum as being, populism as being a question of far left or far right, but not the center. In fact, it's a lot more complicated than that. This is why we talk about anti-politics, because a lot of what gets the name of populism is really a kind of a popular challenge to that form of elite rule of a political class which is detached from the rest of society and which only seeks to basically keep the globalization show on the road. And globalization itself is another alibi for post-politics. It's another way in which politicians say, listen, this is the way of the world. Globalization is a fact, and we have to just adapt to it. So there's no way of trying to take control of politics, take control of society to change it in a way that you might have, for example, higher wages, or you might have a higher standard of living. Globalization is a fact, and you just need to kind of make sure that your country, and this is especially the case not in the United States, which of course is the global hegemon, but even in mid-sized countries, even in a really pretty powerful country like Britain, where it's like, well, we don't really have the capacity to, for example, build out different new industries or build out infrastructure because limited by globalization. This is the way of the world, and so that breeds a big revolt. I mean, should be, I think, pretty self-evident now to people everywhere. I mean, certainly, this might have been news to people maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but now I think you're looking around in wherever country you are, and particularly in the United States, but not limited to that. This would seem obvious to you.
So it's kind of like maybe 15 years ago when, let's say, factories were shutting down in the Midwest. The answer of the politician would be, well, you need to retrain and learn how to code, right? For
Exactly.
we're not going to try and save your industry or save your jobs. That is a kind of globalization has foreclosed that possibility. So you have to adapt, and maybe we'll help you with a training program, but we can't intervene to save your jobs or improve your living standards in the same way. The only way is, let's say, through this obsession actually with education, that you adapt through education.
Well, it's a kind of a form of political theology, right? I mean, if theology kind of will tell you, well, this is the way that God wants it, right? It's like, except that the God is globalization. This is the way that globalization wants it, and we just have to kind of accept and adapt to that, or perhaps repent. Maybe you've made the wrong choices in your life and entered the wrong industry. So you're responsible ultimately for the state of affairs in your life and your declining living standards. So, the best you can do is try to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, retrain, etc. So I think, you're right to highlight that, absolutely. Yeah.
So the anti-politics is a revolt against that mentality, saying, no, actually, you could do something.
You could do something, but it's very important to remember that this all happens in a context after the end of history. And so what does that mean? Society's been deeply depoliticized. There aren't any new ideas out there. So what you have is kind of protests without a banner, right? So people are going out and saying, screw you to the politicians, but without really mobilizing under a vision of how things could be done differently. And that in part kind of explains our political impasse, because the masses kind of return to politics and are angry or on the streets, there's protests, but it's often not in the name of a different vision of what society might be. I mean, previously in the 1960s or in the 1930s and 20s, and indeed in the 1890s, when there was, kind of pre-democratic past, the people came out onto the streets and lifted the banner of anarchism, of socialism, various kind of agrarian revolts, of national liberation, of anti-colonial movements, etc. But they had a kind of some notion, some flag to wave, right? They had political colors, and increasingly these days, things are very inchoate, and maybe there are political symbols, but they're kind of often very cobbled together. It's a mix of different things. You'll have a kind of claim about human rights together with a hammer and sickle, together with the swastika, whatever. You get all sorts of weird and wonderful mixes, and that's a kind of facet of the return of politics in a post-political age, which kind of explains the weird scrambling. And the other element in kind of the strange ideological scramblings of our times is the fact that politics is no longer rooted or anchored in civic associations, in people's long-term commitments to a trade union, to a political party, a mass political party, which actually has real members. That is no longer the case, and it means that politics becomes very unmoored and free-floating and rapidly shifting and carried out often through social media. So it's like a place where you have slogans but without any program, right? And policy is something that happens up at the elite level of politics, in political institutions, whereas politics happens only really in the form of kind of slogans without any kind of organized programmatic content which has been systematically put together. And so you get this very kind of rapidly shifting form of chaotic politics, which some have called hyperpolitics.
So the end of history is not a kind of return to the type of politics that existed before the end of the Cold War, but rather we're at a very strange phase where the old post-politics consensus is broken down. There isn't popular buy-in, but people don't really have a vision of politics beyond that post-political moment.
Right, exactly. And what you end up with is you get kind of these tectonic plates shifting now, particularly in geopolitical terms, the end of U.S. unipolarity, emerging multipolarity, and all sorts of weird and wonderful culture wars. In fact, you kind of get this weird situation where they make claims like there's a new Cold War between China and the U.S., but that misunderstands what the Cold War was. The Cold War was premised on a fundamental ideological division and different recipes and ideas of how to organize society. The one between China and the United States is an intra-capitalist competition. And at the same time, you get culture wars being transplanted to the geopolitical level and geopolitics being played out at a kind of cultural national level, right? So people adopt Israel and Palestine as their flags, or adopt Russia or Ukraine as their flags in domestic political contestation in countries very far away from these places, which I've just mentioned. And then the opposite happens as well. So you get geopolitics played out in weird culture war terms. So Russia presents itself as the home of neo-traditionalism, of if you don't like intersectionality or gay liberation or trans politics or whatever, come to Russia. Russia is the home of traditionalism, and you get the United States playing out its own geopolitical role and intervening in other countries' affairs on the basis of, presumably, as it's sold, as a defender of, gay rights, for example. Indeed, Israel does the same thing. It tries to sell itself on these terms. So you get this weird scrambling of high and low, but it's a very different world, both to the post-politics of the 90s and 2000s and to the ideological contestation, the much more structured, coherent ideological contestation of the Cold War and indeed the period before that.
So as a final question, I want to move on to an article you recently published with Compact magazine entitled The Techno-Populist Conversion, which I feel is a kind of good, let's say, capstone to your broader discussion on the end of history. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the techno-populist conversion as this kind of outcome of this growing contestation of politics in the post-end of history moment?
Right. So we know what technocracy is, right? It's ruled by experts. And we think we know what populism is, though it means a whole bunch of different things. But we can maybe understand it as a sort of anti-political revolt, but without a kind of ideological banner. And what increasingly emerges is a form of what two authors call techno-populism, which is fundamentally that politics is no longer about left and right, but has fused into this techno-populist sort of construction in which all politics is at once technocratic and populist. So it's populist insofar as it says, we represent you, the people, against the elite, and you can choose what side you want. So Trump represents a certain vision of the people against the elite as conceived as being kind of the liberal elite wedded to wokeness and so on. But a Democratic politician in the U.S. will likewise speak for the people, which is to say, multiracial rainbow coalition as against the elite of, maybe bankers or of traditionalists or whatever, right? And so both left and right, such as they are, try to sell themselves on kind of populist bases. But they also are technocratic in the sense of saying that there's only one answer, right? That we can get things done, we can push things through, rather than understanding things in a genuinely political sense of a contestation between distinct interests and ideas in society, right? So they don't represent distinct blocks. You don't have a workers' party representing workers, or a middle class party representing the middle class, or a Christian party representing Christians. It's much more catch-all than that. So politics has become technocratic and populist at the same time. Now, there are figures which come from different parts of the political spectrum, but which increasingly come to resemble each other. Now, if you'll allow me to kind of pick examples which seems a little bit eclectic, but from kind of the kind of world politics as a whole, but particularly from Europe. A politician like Trump, or like the French President Emmanuel Macron, who comes from the Socialist Party, but really a neoliberal, someone associated to finance capital, or a politician like Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, whom you'll know better than I will, but speaks for kind of provincial values, for Islamic conservatism as against the kind of metropolitan elite. These are all really different figures, and yet they all embody this techno-populism. And what do I mean by that is that they're able to kind of in some way capture that populist energy, that insurrection against the old traditional elite, but wield it in kind of technocratic and even kind of conservative interests. And I mean conservative insofar as it doesn't represent a real break with the past, doesn't represent a break with the whole end of history period. It's kind of a continuity on a kind of altered grounds. So all these politicians in their different ways try to are kind of edging their polities beyond the neoliberal era, the era of globalization, to a much more fractious, multipolar world, and adapting to that while trying to speak to popular energies without really genuinely representing popular desires for change. And so in a way, you get this kind of very kind of syncretic or synthetic kind of political movement, which doesn't really answer popular desires.
Well, that's all we have time for this month on Talking History, a production brought to you by Missouri State University Department of History and KSMU Radio. You can listen to this episode as a podcast at ksmu.org or wherever you get your podcasts.